The envelope was sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home that Tuesday morning in early November. It wasn't sealed. Julian never sealed things he wanted me to find. He left them open like small traps, like he was daring me to look inside and confirm what I already suspected. I stood there in my coat, still holding my keys, and I read the return address 3 times before my brain caught up with my eyes. It was from Hartwell and Crane, attorneys at law, Greenwich, Connecticut. And the name on the letter inside wasn't mine. It was hers. I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Not with a fight, not with a door slamming, but with an envelope left open on a kitchen counter, like an afterthought, like I was an afterthought. And the thing I want you to understand, before I tell you the rest of this, is that I was not a woman who had been blindsided. I was a woman who had been watching the blindside coming for 3 years and telling herself she was imagining it. So here are the questions I want you to hold on to while I take you through this story. Why would Julian Sterling, a man who owned 2 investment properties, a partnership stake in a hedge fund, and a house in Greenwich that had been featured in a regional lifestyle magazine, need a lawyer to write a letter to a woman he'd been seeing for less than 6 months? What was he hiding in the accounts I had co-signed on, the accounts I had helped build from the very beginning? And what exactly happened at Thanksgiving dinner that year? The dinner that was supposed to be the crown, jewel of our social calendar, that ended with me standing on the driveway in the November cold, watching the door close behind me? I'm going to tell you all of it. Every document, every conversation, every moment where I should have known and didn't let myself know. And I'm going to tell you how it ended, because it did end, just not the way Julian planned. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. You have to understand where I came from to understand what this life meant to me. I grew up in a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. Not the nice part, the part where the clapboard houses lean a little to one side and the gutters always seem to be half full of something. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office, and my father did what my mother called between things, which mostly meant he was between jobs. We had a dog, a small backyard, and a very clear family hierarchy. My brother, Derek, was at the top of it. Derek was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was about 6 years old, I understood that the rules were different for him, not in an obvious, ugly way that anyone outside our house would have noticed. It was the kind of favoritism that hides itself in language. Derek got the car on weekends because he was responsible. Derek got the bigger bedroom because he needed the space for his equipment. He played guitar badly for about 4 years and then abandoned it completely, but the bedroom stayed his. Derek got the savings account that my parents called his college fund, which they started when he was 12. When I turned 12, my father patted my shoulder and said, "You're a smart girl, Clara. You'll figure it out." I figured it out all right. I got a partial scholarship to UConn. I worked 22 hours a week at the campus library, and I took out loans for the rest. I graduated with a degree in economics and a minor in accounting, and I moved to New York City with $4,000 and a very specific plan. And the plan worked mostly because I am the kind of person who makes plans work. I got a position at a financial advisory firm. I moved up. I learned the language of money the way immigrants learn English, obsessively, with the terror of someone who knows what it costs not to speak it fluently. Derek, for his part, took the college fund and used half of it on a truck and the other half on a business that sold custom fishing rods online, which lasted 18 months before it dissolved. My parents refinanced their house to help him start a second business. That one sold sporting goods wholesale, and it lasted a little longer, but not much. I never said a word about any of it. I met Julian Sterling at a charity gala in 2009. He was 38, I was 32, and he had the kind of confidence that reads differently in retrospect than it does in the moment. At the moment, it read as security. In retrospect, it was performance. He managed a small but profitable hedge fund partnership, Aldercroft Capital, and he had just bought his house in Greenwich. The house was a 1920s colonial with original details and a half-acre lot, and he talked about it the way some men talk about their children, which I found charming then and revealing now. We dated for 2 years and married in 2011. I left my position in New York to manage the household accounts and, increasingly, the business accounts. Julian was brilliant at raising capital and terrible at paperwork. He said so himself, proudly, as though it were a personality trait to be admired. So I became the person who tracked the expenses, filed the returns, organized the quarterly reports, liaised with the accountant. I was, as Julian once introduced me to a client, the engine that keeps the whole thing running. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one for years. The first small thing, the thing that I didn't let myself think about until much later, happened in the spring of 2016, at a dinner party at our neighbor's house, the Ashfords. Virginia Ashford came up to me near the end of the evening while I was refilling my wine glass, and she said, very quietly, "I hope you keep copies of everything, sweetheart, just for yourself." I laughed. I said something about Julian and I being a team. She nodded and smiled and went back to her husband, and I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds on the drive home, before I let it go. Virginia Ashford. I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. We had no children. Julian had been married briefly before and said he was ambivalent about starting over with a family, and I told myself that was fine, that I had other things, that the life we were building was enough. The Greenwich house was enough. The social calendar was enough. Thanksgiving was, in Julian's world, a kind of apex. The one holiday he took seriously. The one event where the house had to be perfect, and the guest list had to be curated, and the turkey had to come from a specific farm in New Hampshire that required ordering in August. I planned it every year. The seating, the menu, the flowers, the wines. Every year. Something small was already growing, even then. I just wasn't calling it by its name yet. The letter from Hartwell and Crane was dated October 28th of that year. I stood in the kitchen and read it twice. It was a letter of intent, a legal document outlining terms of a proposed real estate transaction, a property in Westport, Connecticut, a cottage on a small piece of land near the water. The buyer was listed as Julian K. Sterling. The co-buyer listed was Sienna Vane. I had heard that name once. Julian had mentioned a Sienna at a dinner back in September, said she was an investor contact, someone who'd come through a mutual acquaintance, someone he'd had lunch with a few times to discuss a potential co-investment opportunity. I had no reason not to believe that. I had no reason to reach for anything darker, but the human brain is very good at filing things away for later. And now here was that name on a real estate document, attached to a property that Julian had never mentioned to me, with a purchase price of $640,000. I set the letter down on the counter. I poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't drink. I stood at the kitchen window and watched a squirrel run across the back lawn and disappear into the hedge. Then I picked up the letter and I took a photo of it with my phone. Both pages. I didn't ask Julian about it that night. He came home at 7, poured himself a scotch, asked what I was making for dinner, and sat down at the head of the table with his phone. We talked about the Thanksgiving guest list. He wanted to invite the Pemberton Blacks. I said the Pemberton Blacks had been difficult the last 2 years, and he said they were important, and I said fine. We cleaned up and went to bed, and I lay in the dark for 4 hours while he slept beside me. I kept thinking about one question. If this was a legitimate investment property, why was it being co-purchased with an investor contact and not with me? Why had I never heard about it? And why? This was the question that kept sharpening itself in the quiet of that room. Why had the letter been left on the counter where I would find it? Was it an accident? Or was Julian Sterling, in his particular arrogant way, testing me? Seeing what I would do with what I knew? We had 30 days until Thanksgiving. That was the clock I was living inside, though I didn't know it yet. I found the accountant, Paul Meredith, on a Thursday morning. I drove to his office in Stamford without an appointment. His assistant told me he was with a client, and I sat in the lobby for 40 minutes with my coat folded on my lap, watching the traffic on Summer Street through the glass doors. When Paul came out and saw me, his face did something. I'm not sure what to call it. It wasn't surprise, exactly. It was closer to the expression you make when you've been expecting a conversation and you're not sure you're ready for it. "Clara," he said, "this is unexpected." "I'd like to look at the household accounts," I said, "and the partnership accounts." Paul was a compact man in his late 50s, with small, careful eyes and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He was Julian's accountant, not mine. That distinction had never mattered before, and I could feel it beginning to matter now. He took me into his office and sat across the desk from me, and he folded his hands, and he said he'd need authorization from Julian before sharing anything related to the partnership accounts. "I'm a signatory on those accounts," I said. "You were," he said. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like the silence was a message. When did that change? I asked. Paul looked at his desk. He picked up a pen and set it down again. Clara, he said, I think you should speak with Julian. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about Virginia Ashford saying, keep copies of everything. I thought about how Julian had asked me, 3 months ago, to sign a stack of papers he'd described as routine partnership filings, and I had signed them because I trusted him, because we were a team, because I was the engine. Thank you for your time, I said, and I stood up, and I left. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the time on my dashboard, and I made myself breathe until the shaking in my hands stopped. Then I called Rebecca Cho. Becky was my closest friend from my New York days. She'd gone into family and estate law and had a small practice in Westport. We'd had lunch twice a year for 15 years, and she was the kind of woman who could hear 5 sentences and understand 1,000. She picked up on the second ring. Something's wrong, I said, because with Becky I didn't have to lead up to things. Tell me, she said. I told her. The letter, the property, Paul Meredith's face, the signature removal from the partnership accounts. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough for me to know she was choosing her words. Clara, she said, I need you to do something before you do anything else. I need you to go home, and I need you to get your hands on every paper document in that house that relates to any of your joint finances. Mortgage documents, account statements, anything with both your names on it. Can you do that? Yes, I said. Don't move anything. Don't remove anything from the house. Just look and photograph what you find. Okay, I said. And Clara? Don't tell Julian you spoke to me. The envelope she eventually sent me, a thick manila envelope full of legal notes and preliminary findings, arrived on a Monday morning 3 weeks later. I remember the weight of it in my hands at the front door. I remember thinking that this was what truth felt like when it finally decided to stop hiding. Heavy, unavoidable, and a little bit like grief. I followed Becky's instructions exactly. Over the following 5 days, I went through the filing cabinet in Julian's study with the same systematic attention I had once brought to quarterly financial reports. I photographed everything. The mortgage documents, 3 of them, including a refinancing I hadn't known about, the partnership agreement with its amendments, the account statements going back 18 months, the ones Julian kept physical copies of and which I had never thought to examine closely because I trusted him. What I found over those 5 days was a pattern, not a dramatic single betrayal, but a series of small, careful moves. A refinancing on the house that had pulled out $260,000 in equity that I had helped build, that my income had helped sustain, without my knowledge. Technically, there was a signature page with my name on it, that same stack of routine partnership filings from 3 months ago. I hadn't read them carefully. I had trusted him. I had been the engine. Engines don't ask questions. The partnership accounts had been amended to remove me as a secondary signatory. The household joint account had a transfer history I hadn't examined closely. 12 transfers over 8 months, each one just under the reporting threshold, each one to an account I didn't recognize. The total was somewhere north of $80,000, and then there was the cottage in Westport, the co-buyer, Sienna Vane. I didn't know who she was yet, not really. I knew the name. I knew the letter. I didn't know the rest until Becky sent me the manila envelope with her preliminary research notes, and I sat on the floor of our guest room with the door locked, and I read every page. Sienna Vane was 31. She had worked in finance briefly and now appeared to operate as what her public social profiles described as an independent consultant. She had met Julian through a mutual contact at a charity event. The same charity event, I realized, that Julian had attended alone in August because I had been visiting a college friend in Boston. She and Julian had been photographed at a restaurant opening in November of the previous year. The photo existed in the archive of a regional lifestyle blog. They were not touching in the photo, but they were leaning toward each other in the way that 2 people lean toward each other when they have already decided something. I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I closed my laptop, went downstairs, and started planning Thanksgiving dinner. I know how that sounds, but I had a reason. Julian was comfortable. Julian believed I was oblivious, and Julian, I had realized, was the kind of man who made his biggest mistakes when he was comfortable. I needed him comfortable for exactly 2 more weeks. The Thanksgiving planning continued around me like a stage set being constructed for a play I already knew the ending of. The guest list was finalized, 14 people, including the Pemberton Blacks, who were indeed difficult, and the Hargroves from down the road, and a couple Julian had recently befriended through the fund, a man named Garrett Holloway and his wife Patrice, who wore diamonds to casual dinner parties and had the particular energy of people who are always taking stock of rooms, and Sienna Vane. Julian had added her to the list on a Tuesday evening, casually, the way he would add an item to a grocery list. I've invited Sienna, the investor contact I mentioned. She doesn't have family nearby, and I thought it would be a nice gesture. I looked at him for just a moment longer than usual. Of course, I said. I'll set an extra place. He relaxed. That was the thing about Julian. He relaxed when I agreed with him. The tension in his shoulders would drop a fraction of an inch, and his voice would soften, and he'd move on to the next thing. He relaxed, and I watched him relax, and I felt something cold and quiet settle in my chest. That's when Becky called me with the full picture. The cottage purchase closes on December 5th, she said. He's planning to use the equity from the refinancing and the transferred funds as the down payment. The money he moved without telling me, I said. Yes. Clara, I need you to listen to me carefully. You have legal standing here. The refinancing, the document you signed, your signature was obtained without proper disclosure of the nature of the transaction. That's potentially fraud. The account transfers were made from jointly held funds. The removal of your name from the partnership accounts. There's language in the original partnership agreement that may make that invalid without your written consent. I sat with that for a moment. How long would this take? That depends on how you want to approach it. You could file immediately, or I could wait until after Thanksgiving. There was a pause. Clara, I need him in that house, I said. I need him surrounded by his people, in his world, in the thing he's most proud of. I need him to believe that everything is fine, right up until it isn't. Another pause. Longer. The closing is December 5th, she said again. I know, I said. We have time. The truth was that I had already talked to a second attorney, a colleague of Becky's who specialized in financial fraud and asset protection. His name was David Park, and he had reviewed the documents I'd photographed and had used the words significant exposure and potential criminal referral in the same sentence, calmly, as though those words were not the most serious words I'd heard in my life. He was building a filing. We had everything we needed. We were simply waiting for the right moment. And then, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Julian sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said he wanted to talk. I remember I was rolling out pie crust. My hands were floury, and I had a smudge on my sleeve, and I set down the rolling pin, and I looked at him, and I thought, here it is. Here is the moment he tells me. He looked at his hands. He said, I think we need to talk about where things are going. I waited. He said, I think we've grown apart, Clara. I think we want different things. I think maybe the honest thing is to admit that. He said it the way someone recites a speech they've rehearsed, looking just slightly to the left of my face, the way actors look when they've memorized their eyeline. I said, what kind of different things? He said he needed more space. He said the house felt like it was closing in on him. He said that he hoped we could handle this like adults, that he hoped I understood he had a deep respect for me, that he hoped, and this was the line that I will never forget, the one that told me everything about who Julian Sterling actually was. He hoped I would give him the house, his crown jewel, the thing he loved most. Give him the house and take a settlement that, when he described it, came out to roughly 40% of what I was entitled to based on the assets I'd helped build and the value I'd added and the years I'd given. I looked at my flour-covered hands. I thought about all the Thanksgiving dinners. I thought about the quarterly reports and the partnership filings and the mortgage I'd been paying in every way except literally writing the check. I thought about Virginia Ashford and her quiet warning in a neighbor's kitchen. I said, let's get through Thanksgiving. We can talk about all of this after. He looked relieved. That relief, I think about it still. How completely he had convinced himself that this was going to go his way. The Thanksgiving table was beautiful. I will say that without any irony. The centerpieces were autumn arrangements of dried hydrangeas and copper-tipped branches and small gourds, and the good china was out, and the candles were lit, and the smell of the turkey and the rosemary and the yeast rolls filled the whole downstairs in a way that felt, in any other year, like home. 14 people around the table, Julian at the head, me at the foot, as always. Sienna Vane sat 2 chairs down from Julian on his left side. She was pretty in the way that people who are trying to seem effortlessly pretty are pretty, artfully underdressed for the occasion, a silk blouse and good earrings, hair with just the right amount of careless to it. She talked easily and laughed at Julian's jokes a fraction too quickly. I watched her, and I felt, surprisingly, no anger. What I felt was something closer to recognition. She was doing what Julian had told her to do, probably. She didn't know what was coming. In a different set of circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her, but I was mostly focused on the breadbasket and the conversation and the clock on the dining room wall and the text message I was waiting for. It came at 8:47 p.m. David Park. 3 words. Filing confirmed. Tomorrow morning. I set my phone face down on the tablecloth. Julian stood up then. He always did a little toast midway through dessert, a tradition he'd established early in our marriage that he was very proud of. He held up his glass and said something about gratitude and abundance and the people in this room who matter. He looked at me when he said it, with a smile that was, I realized, saying goodbye. He was toasting himself on his own cleverness, on getting away with it. Garrett Holloway made a joke. The table laughed. Julian sat down, and I looked at him, and he looked back, and for a fraction of a second, I want to believe this, I think it's true, something like recognition crossed his face. Like he saw, for just a moment, that I had not been oblivious. Then Patrice Holloway asked about the plans for Christmas, and the moment passed, and Julian was talking again, and I was quiet. After dessert, when guests were standing and saying their goodbyes in the front hall, Julian took me by the elbow, not roughly, with the practiced gentleness of someone who knows how to perform in front of an audience. He guided me into the kitchen, closed the door between us and the hall, and said very quietly, "I think you should stay at Derek's tonight." I blinked at him. "I'm sorry? I'd like some space," he said. "We talked about this. I think tonight is a good night to start giving each other some room." He was very calm. He had clearly decided when this was going to happen, and Thanksgiving night was his choice. The holiday was over. The performance was done. And now he was discarding what he no longer needed. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about everything I knew and everything he didn't know I knew. And then I said, "All right, I got my coat. I got my purse, which had in it my phone, my keys, and a thumb drive with copies of every document I had photographed over the previous 3 weeks. I went out through the front door, past the last of the departing guests, past Sienna Vane, who was pulling on her coat in the front hall, and who glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And I walked to my car in the November cold, and I sat in the driver's seat and I looked at the house, all the lights on, the warm gold of it in the dark, and I thought, this is the last time it will look like this to you. I drove to a hotel in Stamford. Not Derek's. I hadn't spoken to Derek in 4 months. I ordered room service, and I turned on the television, and I didn't sleep very much. And at 9 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning, on the day after, which was still technically Thanksgiving weekend, I called Becky. "It's starting," I said. "I know," she said. "David called. The filing's in motion." "Good," I said. Outside the hotel window, the parking lot was gray and mostly empty, and the sky had that particular flat November light that means winter is coming whether you're ready for it or not. I sat in the armchair by the window, with my coffee getting cold, and I thought about that kitchen counter and the open envelope and how long I had known what I knew before I let myself know it. And then I started making calls. The filing hit on the Friday after Thanksgiving. David Park and his firm filed an emergency motion to freeze the jointly held accounts based on the evidence of unauthorized transfers and the fraudulent nature of the refinancing signature. Simultaneously, Becky filed a notice of contested asset claims in family court, which effectively put a legal flag on the Greenwich house, the partnership interest, and the Westport property purchase, the one scheduled to close in 9 days. Julian found out sometime Friday afternoon. I know this because he called me at 4:17 p.m., and the voice on the other end of the phone was not the calm, controlled Julian who had guided me out of the kitchen on Thanksgiving night. It was a different voice, higher, tighter, the voice of a man whose comfortable world had just lurched sideways and who was scrambling to understand what had moved it. "What have you done?" he said. I was in Becky's office when he called, sitting in a chair across from her desk with a cup of tea that was also going cold, because I kept forgetting to drink things. "I've protected myself," I said, "which is what I should have done a long time ago." He said my name. He said it several times, in different tones, angry, then cajoling, then something that almost sounded like pleading, and I sat with my tea, and I listened to all the versions of my name in his voice, and I did not feel what he was hoping I would feel. "The Westport property," he said finally. "You're going to blow up the Westport property." "The Westport property," I said, "was purchased partially with money taken from our jointly held accounts without my knowledge or consent." David Park has described this as, and I'm reading from my notes here, an exposure with potential for criminal referral. Silence. "Julian," I said, "I'd like you to have your attorney call David Park." I ended the call. My hand was shaking slightly, and I set the phone on Becky's desk, and I pressed both hands flat on my knees until the shaking stopped. Becky was watching me with an expression that was professional, but also something else, something that looked like pride, maybe, or solidarity. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Like I've been holding my breath for 3 years, I said, and I just exhaled. The legal process that followed was not fast or clean or satisfying in the way that legal processes are satisfying in movies. Real legal processes are grinding and expensive and full of documents that have to be filed and refiled and responded to and contested. But the evidence was very clear. 18 months of documented financial transfers, a refinancing signed under false pretenses, a partnership amendment that violated the original agreement's terms. David Park's language in the filings was measured and precise and devastating. Julian's attorney, a man from a white shoe firm in Hartford who clearly expected to walk this back quickly, had a series of increasingly difficult conversations with David over the following weeks. The Westport closing did not happen on December 5th. The accounts remained frozen. The partnership interest, which represented Julian's primary income stream, was subject to a court order pending resolution of the contested claims. And Garrett Holloway, the fun partner with the diamond-wearing wife, the man who had been at our Thanksgiving table, withdrew his capital commitment from Aldercroft Capital the following Monday. His assistant called Julian's office and left a voicemail that Julian's own assistant relayed to him. Garrett Holloway had received a courtesy call from an attorney's office about the pending litigation and had decided, as a precaution, to revisit his relationship with the fund. Julian called Garrett directly. Garrett did not take the call. Then the second largest investor made the same decision. Then the third. Aldercroft Capital did not formally dissolve immediately. These things take time. But the capital dried up over a period of about 6 weeks, in the way that capital dries up when confidence collapses. Not all at once, but decisively, like a tide going out and not coming back. I heard about this in pieces, from Becky, from David, once, from Virginia Ashford, who called me at the hotel. I had moved to a furnished short-term rental in Stamford by then, and said simply, "I always knew you had it in you, sweetheart." Sienna Vane, for her part, ended her relationship with Julian shortly after the Westport closing collapsed. I don't know the details, and I didn't seek them out. What I know is that the property was never purchased. The relationship that was supposed to anchor it apparently dissolved under the weight of its own circumstances. And Julian Sterling was left, in January, in the Greenwich house. The house I had put my hands on. The house I had filled with Thanksgiving dinners and quarterly reports and the careful work of a life, waiting for the equity courts to decide what it was worth and who was entitled to what portion of it. He was in that house alone. There was a moment in late November, about 2 weeks after the filing, when I almost lost my footing. I don't tell this part because it's easy. I tell it because it's true. I was in the furnished rental on a Tuesday night, eating dinner alone at a table that wasn't mine, looking at walls I'd never chosen, and I started to feel something I wasn't expecting. Not anger, not triumph, just loneliness. The particular loneliness of having done the right thing in a situation where doing the right thing costs you everything that felt like home. I picked up my phone and I almost called Julian. I held the phone for a long moment. My thumb was hovering over his name, and I thought about the envelope on the kitchen counter. The open envelope, left there like a dare. The Thanksgiving toast where he'd looked at me and smiled with the expression of a man who believed he had already won. The voice on the phone saying, "What have you done?" As though I were the one who had done something wrong. I put the phone down. I made myself some tea. I sat in the chair by the window of that rental apartment that was not my home, and I thought about who I had been before Julian Sterling, before Greenwich, before the quarterly reports, and the curated dinner parties, and the social calendar that had somehow become the shape of my life. I thought about UConn, about working 22 hours a week in the library, about $4,000 and a plan, about the degree in economics and the minor in accounting, and the fact that I had built a financial life for two people and I could build one for one. I wrote 4 things in the notebook I keep by my bed. They weren't dramatic things. They were practical things, steps I needed to take, calls I needed to make, a timeline for what came next. That's how I have always worked. When everything falls apart, I make a list. It doesn't fix the loneliness, but it gives the loneliness something to push against. The next morning, I called a financial advisor friend from my New York days, a woman named Tamara, who worked independently and who had known me before Julian, and who had sent me a single text in early December that said only, "I'm here if you need me." I called her and I said I needed to think through what a clean financial restart looked like, and she said, "Come in Thursday and we'll sit down." And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person in possession of her own future. There was something else I did that week, something smaller and more private. I called my mother, not Derek, my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring, and she sounded surprised, and then not surprised, the way mothers do when they know something is coming before it arrives. I told her, carefully, what had been happening. Not all of it. Some of it was still legally sensitive, but enough. And my mother, who had called Derek responsible and given him the bedroom and the college fund and let me figure it out, was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said, "Oh, Clara, I'm sorry I didn't pay more attention." I hadn't expected that. I had expected her to say something about keeping the peace, or giving Julian the benefit of the doubt, or how divorce is hard on everyone. Instead, she said, "I'm sorry I didn't pay more attention." And something in me that had been braced against a blow relaxed slightly. For the first time. "I'm going to be fine, Mom," I said. "I know you are," she said. "You always have been." Hi. The equitable distribution process in Connecticut has specific legal frameworks, and I'm not going to walk you through all of them because David Park did that, and he did it better than I could. What I will tell you is this. The outcome was not a quick victory. It was a methodical, documented, proof-by-proof reconstruction of what I had contributed and what had been taken. Julian's attorney made several arguments. He argued that my contributions to the household were not financial contributions in the technical sense. David Park introduced 12 years of tax returns showing my income, plus documentation of the financial management work I had performed for the partnership, plus an expert assessment of the market value of those services if they had been performed by a paid professional. The number was significant. He argued that the refinancing signature was valid because I had signed the document. David Park introduced the original document alongside a clear language summary of what the refinancing actually meant, a summary that had not been provided to me before signing, and a financial expert who testified that no reasonable person could have understood the nature of what they were signing from the document alone. The judge listened carefully. He argued that the partnership account amendments were within Julian's rights as managing partner. Becky cross-referenced the original partnership agreement's amendment terms, which required written consent from all signatories on accounts of this type. I had not provided written consent. I had not been asked for it. The amendment was found to be procedurally invalid. One by one, the arguments fell. Not dramatically, without the soundtrack, without the camera close-up, just methodically, like a structure being carefully disassembled by people who know which bolts are load-bearing. The Greenwich house was sold. The equity was divided, and my portion was, after all the accounting, substantially larger than the 40% Julian had offered me in the kitchen on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The partnership interest, what remained of it, which was not much, given the capital withdrawals, was appraised and factored into the settlement. The transferred funds were addressed. There was a financial reckoning that David Park had prepared for and Julian had not. There was one moment in the process that I want to describe, because it is the moment I come back to when I think about what justice actually looks like up close. It was at a deposition, in a conference room in downtown Hartford on a gray February morning. Julian was across the table from me for the first time since I had left the house on Thanksgiving night. He looked tired. He had lost some of the careful grooming he was always so precise about. A little thinner in the face, a little less pressed in the collar. His attorney was beside him, and David Park was beside me, and the court reporter was at the end of the table. At a certain point, David was asking Julian about the household financial management, who had performed it, how consistently, at what level of involvement, and Julian said haltingly that it had been a shared responsibility, that we had both been involved, that he couldn't say that I had been primarily responsible. And David Park slid a folder across the table. It contained printouts of emails between Julian and his business partners, going back 7 years, in which Julian referred to me by name as the one managing the accounts, confirming my sign-off, directing people to contact me for financial details. 14 emails across 7 years. The one from 2017 even used the phrase, "Clara runs the books. She's more reliable than any CFO I've ever worked with." Julian looked at those emails for a moment. Then he looked up and across the table at me. I did not look away. I did not smile. I just held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had been preparing for this moment for much longer than he knew. His attorney asked for a short break. We took the break. We came back. And Julian's attorney made an offer, which David Park and I discussed in the hallway outside the conference room in low voices while the court reporter ate a granola bar. The offer was substantially better than the one Julian had made in the kitchen on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We did not accept it immediately. We went back in, and David Park made a counter. We were done by lunch. There is something that happened after the settlement that I did not expect, and I want to tell you about it because I think it matters. It was March. Things had been finalized, the paperwork signed, and I was in the process of winding down the Stamford rental and preparing to move into a smaller house, a much smaller house, a Cape style on a quiet road in Fairfield County that I had found with a buyer's agent and which had a kitchen I liked, and a back porch that faced east, and a yard that a previous owner had planted with hydrangeas. I was learning to be someone who lived in that kind of house, which was different from learning to be someone who lived in the Greenwich house. My phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. It was Julian. He said my name, quietly. He said he'd gotten the number from someone. He didn't say who. He said he was sorry to bother me. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. There was a pause, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, and I want to be precise here, because I've thought about these words many times. He said, "I think I forgot who you were." I didn't say anything. He said, I think I stopped seeing you. I took it for granted. All of it. Everything you did. I think I convinced myself you weren't, I don't know, that you weren't essential, I offered. A long pause. Yes, he said. I sat with that for a moment. He was calling from somewhere that sounded like a restaurant. I could hear the low murmur of background conversation, the clink of glasses. He was alone, I thought, eating alone somewhere. "Julian," I said, "I don't think you forgot who I was. I think you knew exactly who I was, and you decided it didn't matter. Those are different things." He didn't respond to that right away. And in the silence, I thought, this is the part where people say something about forgiveness, about moving forward, about not letting bitterness take hold. And I am going to be honest with you. I was not at a point in my life where I had a lot of language about forgiveness. What I had was a very clear-eyed understanding of what had happened, and what it had cost me, and what I had done about it. What I said was, I hope you find something to build. I really do. But I can't be part of it, and I can't be the foundation for it anymore. He said he understood. He said one more thing, almost too quietly to hear, before he ended the call. He said, "You were the best thing I ever had, and the biggest mistake I ever made was not seeing it." I set my phone down on the kitchen counter of the Stamford rental. The last few days I'd be in it. I looked out the window at a parking lot, and a bare tree, and a pale March sky, and I thought about that for a while, not with anger, and not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular emotion that has no good name, the feeling of something being over, completely, finally, irrevocably over. I didn't call him back. Let me tell you where things actually stand, because I think the honest ending matters more than the satisfying one. It is spring now. Real spring. The kind where the forsythia is out along the roadsides, and the air has a quality in the morning that makes you want to stand outside for an extra minute with your coffee. I am in the Fairfield County house. The hydrangeas have not bloomed yet, but I can see the buds on the branches, dense and green, waiting. I have gone back to work, not at a firm, My own practice, consulting. The thing I know how to do better than almost anything. Financial management for small businesses and investment partnerships with an emphasis on documentation and compliance. Tamara helped me structure it. I have 4 clients. In 6 months, I expect to have 8. It is, like most things I have built, a slow and careful construction. My mother came to visit in February. She brought a casserole that was not very good, and she sat at my kitchen table for 2 days, and we talked about things we had not talked about in years. She said she was sorry twice more. Once on the first evening, unprompted, over tea. The second time she said it, she was looking out at the back porch, and she said, "I always knew you'd make something, Clara. I should have told you that more." I told her I was glad she was here. That was enough. Derek called. Once. He heard through our mother that things had happened, and he said he was sorry, and he offered help. Financial help, which was awkward given the history and the fishing rod business and the wholesale sporting goods and the refinanced house. And I told him I didn't need it, which was true, and that I appreciated the call, which was also true, but barely. We are working on being cordial. It is slow work. Julian's situation, as best I understand it through what Becky has mentioned in passing, Aldercroft Capital did formally wind down by spring. He has taken a position with a different fund, smaller, not as a partner, but as an advisor. The Greenwich house sold at a number that was reasonable but not exceptional, given the carrying costs during the legal process. He is renting in Fairfield. We exist in overlapping geography without crossing paths, which a county the size of this one somehow accommodates. I do not know what happened with Sienna Vane. I do not think about Sienna Vane very often. She was a chapter in someone else's story, and that story is no longer mine. Virginia Ashford sent me a card when the settlement was finalized, a paper card mailed to the rental address I'd given Becky, who must have given it to her. It said, in Virginia's very upright handwriting, "Well done, V." I have it on the windowsill in my office, propped against the glass, where I can see it when I'm working. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known earlier. Not the legal knowledge, though I wish I had that too. The other kind. The kind that is about how you build a life, and who you build it with, and what it means to be someone's engine versus someone's partner. I was Julian's engine for 12 years. I kept the books and filed the papers and organized the dinners and maintained the social world he presented to other people as his own creation. I did this because I thought that was love, that the invisible work, done faithfully, was its own kind of declaration. I believed that people who love you see the invisible things you do, even if they never say so. They don't always. Some people look right through the invisible things and see only what is obvious and flashy and loud. And then, when the invisible things are gone, when the engine stops, only then do they understand what was holding everything up. Julian understood too late. That is his consequence, and it is a real one. And I am not going to pretend I feel nothing when I think about it. I do feel something. It is not triumph. It is closer to the feeling of watching a glass fall off a table in slow motion. You saw it coming. You could not stop it. And now it's broken. And there's nothing to do about it but clean it up and be more careful next time. I am more careful now. About everything. I was in the grocery store last week, a Tuesday morning, just after the early rush had cleared, and I ran into Patrice Holloway, Garrett's diamond earring wife, in the produce section. She was selecting apples with the focused intensity that some people bring to small choices. She looked up and saw me, and for a moment I thought she would pretend not to recognize me. Instead, she smiled, a real one, small but genuine, and said, "Clara, you look well." "I am," I said, and I meant it. She paused, holding her apple. "Garrett always said you were the smart one," she said. "Forgive me for not saying so sooner." I thanked her. We went our separate ways down the produce aisle, and I stood for a moment in front of a display of winter pears, and I thought about the Thanksgiving table, the candles, the centerpiece, the 14 people, the toast, the text message from David Park, filing confirmed, tomorrow morning. And then I put some pears in my basket, and I kept moving, because that is what you do. You keep moving. I want to leave you with one last image, because I think the right ending for this story isn't a courtroom, and it isn't a phone call, and it isn't even a settlement figure. It's this. Last Saturday morning, 6:15. The eastern sky over my back porch was that specific shade of early spring pink that only lasts about 4 minutes before it turns ordinary. I was standing on the porch in my robe with my coffee, the real cup this time, not the cold, forgotten one, and the neighborhood was completely quiet, except for birds somewhere in the hydrangea bushes. I thought about Thanksgiving, about standing at the foot of that long table for 12 years, planning the menus, arranging the flowers, making sure everyone had what they needed, about the moment the door closed on me in the November cold. He threw me out like trash on Thanksgiving. He believed that was the end of the story. He believed that without the house and the dinner table and the social world he had given me, I would dissolve, become irrelevant, small, forgotten. What he didn't understand is that I was never standing there because of him. I was standing there because of me, because of what I had built and organized and made beautiful and real. And those things don't disappear when you leave a house. They go with you. The hydrangeas budded and the coffee cooled only a little, and the pink sky turned ordinary. And I stayed on the porch anyway, just a little longer than I needed to, because it was mine. The morning was mine. The house was mine. The future, uncertain and real and full of the kind of work I know how to do, was mine. That's where I am. That's how this ends. And maybe the most important thing I can tell you, the thing I want you to carry with you when you close this story and go back to your own, is this. The most dangerous moment in being underestimated is not the moment they dismiss you. It's the moment you start to believe them. I almost did. I almost let Julian's version of me become the one I lived inside. I didn't, and that made all the difference. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.